A warm welcome to this 11th webinar in this series. And today's session's called Taking Care of Ourselves, Our Relationships, and the World. So it's that sense of care moving through concentric circles of the self, the kind of social world that we're a part of, and also the things in the wider world that we care about, that are meaningful to us, that we value. Jean-Paul Sartre, quite a few years ago, said, everything's been figured out except how to live. You know, people talk about pivot points at various points in history, and of course, that would have been quite a few decades ago. And I guess he was talking about technology, and he was talking about urbanization, and he was talking about kind of industrialization. And of course, that's even more true now in the world of just rapid change and all of the things that are happening in the world. But of course, we do know how to live. Pretty well every religion, every contemplative tradition, so much of applied philosophy is about how to live. It's rich with ideas, thousands of years old, about how to live a good life, a virtuous life, a happy life, a meaningful life. It's just that we're not necessarily mainstreaming that in society. It's not as, every day as what we know about physical health. The kind of main point I really want to make in this webinar is that a point that Richie Davidson makes, which is that, and it's quite radical actually, and not many people say this, but well-being is a skill. What he means by that, I guess, is that it's a set of different skills that we have, either inherently in sort of evolutionary terms, or skills that we can learn and cultivate. And I guess that's the kind of main theme running through what I want to talk about in the next half an hour or so and explore with you through kind of some practices and some exercises and some teaching as well. I'm guessing most of you will be familiar with Abraham Maslow's so-called hierarchy of needs. It was sort of pyramid, and it's sort of very intuitive and it makes sense. And he basically says that, we as human beings have this sort of pyramid of needs. And at the very bottom is the sort of obvious physiological needs that if we don't eat, we don't drink, we don't sleep, we don't look after our bodies, then nothing else is really possible. And he places on top of that a sense of sort of safety. And then he talks about belonging. And then he talks about sort of meaning and esteem. And then just at the very sort of tip of this pyramid, he talks about self-actualization. And I guess it's a very intuitively appealing idea that we have these sort of basic things. And as we put them in place, we're able to kind of have a sort of sense of transcendence, if you like. I want to take the very best of what Maslow is saying, but I actually want to challenge it a little bit. And I was doing some reading about Maslow, and it turns out that Maslow, as a very young man in his early training in 1938, was doing anthropological research on a Native American reservation, the Blackfoot group of Native Americans near Alberta in Canada. And, this can't be substantiated because it's kind of speculation, but they had a hierarchy of needs in the form of one of their kind of like homes, their sort of tent structures. But Maslow, I guess, westernized it and Americanized it because the Blackfoot Native Americans had it completely the other way around. They placed the self at the bottom. And then they talked about reciprocal relationships between us, but also all of the people around us. But they extended that further still to animals and plants and the land that we live on. And they talked about attributes and qualities that support that, of generosity, of community, and of courage. And the balance, sorry, not the balance, the aim was not self-actualization. It wasn't transcendence. It wasn't this very individualized idea. But for the Blackfoot Native Americans, the sort of very top was a sense of balance between self and others and the natural world. And that sense of balance in a way that's sustainable over time. And time, of course, in this construction is sort of fluid and cyclical and dynamic. And it shows us, if you take the very best of Maslow, and I've just come back from a month traveling in China and India, and actually was there 30 years plus earlier, and just to see the change, there's no doubt, of course, that we need those basic needs met, and we need that sense of community. And without that, very little else is possible. And witnessing some of the extreme poverty in places like India, um, you can see how essential that sort of fabric is and how important that is. But what I think is so interesting about that First Nations perspective is it shows us that sense, and I think that's just absolutely key, that well-being is relational and it is systemic. And that's a sort of bit of an academic word, but essentially means it's part of my well-being. Your well-being is part of a collective community of people who in turn are part of something larger. And it's really difficult to see those as not integrally related to one another. So I think where I'd like to start is this idea that well-being relies on some of these foundational things: safety, physical needs, sense of belonging, and that it's a skill that can be learned, and that it is very difficult to think of it not as part of something larger and something wider. And there's a lot of kind of research that I'll just briefly touch on as I go through that relates to this. As I said, this is the 11th of 12 webinars, which is part of this sort of sense of building a life well lived. And kind of what I'd like to offer today is this idea of what we've been doing in the previous 11, and everything that you've done in your own journey so far is a bit like putting a kind of a jazz group together, and a very accomplished jazz group. You know, you've got your can't say the word, the person who plays the saxophone, the trumpet, the keyboards, all the different instruments, and they're very accomplished. You're bringing them together and they're beginning to play in a way that can really have a sense of a life well lived, and maybe even quite a lot of kind of that sense of improvisation, that sense of really moving to different circumstances and situations. And the practice I'd like to just suggest we drop into for a little moment now is a practice which is in a way quite advanced, but also in a way, you know, as often with these things, quite paradoxical, very, very simple, but a sort of open awareness practice. So what I'd like to invite you to do is just to take a moment, just check into your posture, and take a posture that feels like your feet and your sitting bones are really planted on the ground. So there's actually a real sense of connection between your body, the contact points with the earth, and the earth itself. Just maybe offer the word rooted. We've spoken about the idea of a tree being an interesting way of having a sort of image that we can internalize for practices. So sitting bones and the feet are like the root system, really moving into the earth that we're sitting on with a sense of groundedness, a sense of rootedness. The pelvis and the torso rising up like the trunk of a tree. The arms, the fingers, thumbs, like the branches of the tree, and the head, the apex of the tree. Just having a sense of a rooted, majestic, strong, flexible tree. Just opening out the awareness. And what I mean by that is giving permission to whatever comes up in awareness to be held lightly, to be seen with curiosity. To be met with a sense of balance. It's going to be sounds, could be body sensations, could be thoughts or images. Could be emotional states. Just opening up to whatever comes into awareness. And the sense of the tree can be helpful here because the tree, of course, is open to whatever weather systems come through, whatever the prevailing climate is. And it kind of accepts and adapts to all of that. People pass by, animals settle in the branches, then go on their way. Open awareness, curious, non-grasping, just open to what comes, allowing things to pass away naturally. How is it to have this open awareness from a place of real embodiment, rootedness, majesty and the strength, but also the flexibility that a tree kind of gives a sense of. And if it's not stretching the metaphor too far, just have a sense of all the other people on this call right now. And who will listen to this afterwards, like a forest of trees, And what we now know, of course, is that trees are really, in a forest, are really interconnected, both through their root systems, but also through their canopies, in ways we barely understood, at least through kind of modern science, but maybe some of the Native American and other more ancient ways of seeing and understanding the world did know and did appreciate. So an awareness that extends from the self to all the others on this call and beyond in this moment. Thank you. I'd like to just move through the three sections really of taking care of ourselves, taking care of our relationships, taking care of the world, and move to this idea of well-being and self-care being a skill. So this is my smartphone, and of course in the top right-hand corner it has a battery meter, and that battery meter um, is something that we look at, right? And when we look at it, we have a very good sense of um, is our smartphone in good shape? Is it going to look after? Is it going to be able to do what we want it to do for the next foreseeable future? Or is it actually, ooh, we need to pay attention? Or is it critical? Is it going to shut down at any moment? We need to charge it in some way. And what I'd like to suggest is that one of the things that mindfulness practice enables us to do is to begin to cultivate a more kind of attuned sense of our own battery meter. And sometimes, I talk about this idea of like a sort of public health or global health kind of uh, curve of well-being, from really in a lot of trouble, I'm not doing great at all, through to languishing, through to well, through to thriving. And I guess that corresponds a bit to the critical battery, through to, oh, it just, it's, I haven't got a huge amount of time on it, through to, oh, it's in good shape, through to it's fully charged. And the battery is in good shape. And just maybe ask you to do this right now. The first step of the breathing space is to just change our posture and then settle into the body and scan through the body and pick up whatever's in the body. Any kind of sense of ease, a sense of energy, sense of relaxation or tension or contraction or fatigue. And extending that to the mind, the quality of the mind right now. Is it alert and tuned in and interested, or is it a bit foggy and tired and scattered? So that first step of the breathing space is essentially a way of checking in and asking ourselves, what is the state of my mind and body right now? A bit like the battery meter. And having then in the second step of the breathing space kind of gathered and anchored and then broadened out to a sense of the whole body, we have a sense of, actually quite now, right now, I'm quite contracted and quite tight and a bit tired. And the breathing space, as we've been talking about, is this always first step for responding skillfully. So in my book, I developed these four characters, and Sam is a young man who works in intensive care as a nurse. And he talks about sometimes running on fumes. working very long shifts, coming home, not really kind of down regulating, and then sort of not eating well and spending his evenings socializing and gaming and then getting up early the next morning. And after a period of time, he's running on fumes. Another character, Sophia, developed Parkinson's and realizes that actually when she does the breathing space, she's very rarely in her body mind above 70%, if we use that battery kind of metaphor. And that's just the body and the disease process that's happening with Parkinson's. And Sophia's needing to recalibrate. It's needing to reset where she's at and what she's able to do. So that battery meter is a really, really important part of self-care. And often we don't pay attention until things are broken. And what I'd like to suggest here is that, in the original mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression program, and depression is something I've spent most of my career working on and have suffered myself. Maslach talks about sort of burnout, which is quite similar to depression, and where people kind of really get to a point of emotional exhaustion and feeling quite sort of depersonalized. And we talk in the Empathy for Depression program about the so-called exhaustion funnel. So this idea of a funnel that is spiraling down into exhaustion and depression. And there's a sense of closing and narrowing as, Sam, for example, doesn't look after himself, works too far, or Sophia is just, she's also as a grandmother and a partner and does all the things that she do. It's quite easy to just stop neglecting the things that we need to do to look after ourselves, and we can go down this exhaustion funnel. If you just take a moment and flip that on its head, it is possible to think about a thriving funnel. That if we can be tuned in to where we're at and we can make sure we do things that are nourishing, that are meaningful, that are valuable, we can essentially have a thriving funnel which broadens and expands. And of course, these are not mutually exclusive, but it's a really interesting idea that we're not thinking about only waking up and changing what we do when we get to the point of exhaustion. We're thinking and integrating into our lives this idea of a potentially broadening and building and cultivating well-being as a skill. Everything, if you think about that jazz band again, everything we've done up to now is in the service potentially of doing that. So in the very first webinar, we spoke about mindfulness as having these three parts: attention and awareness, befriending, and a sense of connecting with intention. The development, the cultivation of all of those is absolutely key to kind of recognizing where we're at, knowing what needs to happen, and beginning to respond wisely moment by moment throughout our day. So I'd like to just invite you to think about an exercise or a couple of exercises that will flow one into the next. I'd like you just to think about the day up to this point. So if it's later in the day, from the moment you woke up to now, if it's earlier in the day, fine to go to yesterday or the day before. And just cast your mind back through the day and chunk it into sort of sections: getting out of bed, having a first drink of the day, maybe having some food, the first people that you interacted with, what you went and just chunk it into the day, into sections. And just consider for each of those sections, was that something that nourished you, that gave you a sense of a battery uplift, if you like? Or was it something that drained your battery? Some things drain and charge the battery. it's possible to put a phone on a charger and actually have an app running at the same time, and the battery doesn't quite know whether to go up and down. So it's possibly possible to have some nourishment, but also some draining at the same time. Let's just scan through the day. And maybe this is an exploration that can be longer and further and could take into, could do this in your own time later. Maybe just scan back through the week and the last month to reflect on what is it in your life that consistently is nourishing, consistently draining, or potentially a bit of both. And then there's a really interesting question there about what is it that makes it both? And is there anything where there could be like an adjustment that would shift something from being draining to being nourishing? So one of the ways in which this practice, this sort of sense of having a more clear idea of what's nourishing and draining in our lives can be developed further is again building something that we did in the very first webinar. So there was this invitation in the first webinar to think about how we start our day and how we end our day. So at some point between waking up and when we get into our day, just having a sense of what's up today, what's happening today. Is there something I'm really looking forward to? Is there something that's going to be a bit more challenging? Is there something that is really meaningful to me? And sort of in a sense, setting an intention for the day. Oh, I'd really like to be present for that challenging conversation. And maybe just see if I can do that in a way that feels kind of caring and compassionate and patient. And I don't kind of lose my sense of self in that conversation. And then ending the day is the same thing, but reviewing it from the back. And now, one of the ways in which this can be really interesting is, of course, when you think about the kind of things that you know nourish and deplete you, if you add to that what you've discovered over the weeks and months of what you appreciate, you can begin to start going, gosh, you know what? Walking my dog or journaling or really being present to a good friend as they tell me about what's happening. The list, of course, is endless, but really beginning to know what's meaningful to us, what's important to us, what we appreciate, what nourishes us, enables us to begin to think, do I need to just maybe recalibrate my life a little bit? Do I need to maybe do a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that? And when I do that, what happens? So it becomes like a sort of exploration. It becomes like a sort of something that we can be playful with and interested in. So I spoke about these three keys of mindfulness, and the last one was intention. So what I'd like to, again, invite you to do now, just this kind of rolling set of exercises and practices, which are about this exploration of what it means to take care of ourselves. What I'd like to do, ask you to do, is to imagine your future self at some point in the future. It doesn't matter when it is, but this future self has a real sense of ease. To see if you can actually visualize this future self, this future you, a sense of ease, a sense of contentment, a sense of being really present. Real sense actually of kind of that you is really embodied and authentic and sort of a sense of integrity. Maybe there's a lightness and a kind of smile and a humor too. See if you can see this person, this you, this future you. And once you've got a sense of this future you, and if this doesn't feel like it's possible, that's absolutely fine. Just let it go. But if it's possible to have this sense of this future you that kind of has this sense of presence and ease and authenticity, just have a sense of them coming alongside you. A really dear, good friend. And you kind of look to them and you have this kind of question in your mind. And you ask this question even of inviting this future version of yourself to maybe just give you some guidance. What does living well look like for you? For me? Where might I just make some recalibrations? What am I doing well? What's important to me? What's meaningful to me? Am I investing my energy, my time, and the things that give me a sense of joy and meaning and purpose and nourishment? This older self just helps you to clarify that. And what this exercise is doing is it's beginning to explore. It's beginning to explore this sense of your values, your compass. And that's the last part that I wanted to speak to you about, this sense of self, of our values being a really important kind of compass in guiding us to what's important, what's valuable. So what I'd like to do now is just give voice to a couple of the characters from the book at the point in which they've kind of been integrating mindfulness in their life very much as you all have. And they're reflecting on this question of what's nourishing, what they appreciate, what's draining, what's difficult. So let me just share my screen so that I can do this. Here we go. And here they are. There's three of the characters you'll hear now.
If I have a good night's sleep, I feel so much better, like my brain has rested and processed stuff while I was asleep, which of course it has. Sleep probably makes the biggest difference between a bad and good day to me.
What nourishes me? Nature, swimming, singing, Rufus, my dog, healthy food, and rest. I'm lucky to be more or less retired, so I choose a lot of what I do. But I was surprised that spending time with family and friends could be both nourishing and depleting. I need time on my own to recharge my batteries. Also, my grandson can be quite draining, but also nourishing. He's a toddler and has so much energy. Then I realized, to my surprise, that one of my best friends is almost always draining. I feel guilty even having that thought. I need to think about that.
I don't have a car, can't afford it. Plus, there's nowhere to park. So I cycle to work, and it takes about 20 minutes. Now here's the weird part. Weekend bike rides? Pure fun. Cycling to work? A chore. That's what I thought until I stopped to look at it. That doesn't make sense. I switched it up. Dodging traffic on my bike, getting my heart revving first thing, it's a natural wake-up call. And get this, part of my route is through a park. People say it's sketchy with kids doing their thing and smoking dope, and there are some people selling drugs. But I roll through it anyway. When I head home, some of the kids throw a hi my way. It's like they found somewhere they feel safe.
Using your inventory. So it's all there, isn't it? In Ling's case, she's talking about the importance of sleep. Ling has a sort of trauma history, and that we know a lot about sleep and the way in which sleep is about integrating memories and integrating the day and consolidation and processing things. And then you hear with Sam at the end there, this way in which he switches up, he changes his relationship to his commute to work. And his commute to work becomes something about raising his heart rate and getting ready for the day. And that's what I'm pointing to here about this skill. And you hear it in all three of those different characters. So I want to just shift to the next part of this, which is relationships. And I'll go quite briefly through this, but the chapter in the book really develops this a little bit more. But essentially, everything that you know and you've learned and you've practiced through mindfulness practice can be a resource to you in thinking about mindfulness and relationships. We are part of a larger family. We are deeply social. We evolved to only really be able to survive as part of a group. That's why loneliness is so incredibly painful. And solitary confinement in prisons is kind of a punishment of last resort. We're deeply sociable, and many of you will know the so-called Harvard longitudinal study. They started with a group of people in 1938, and they've been following them up for, I guess, 80 plus years now. And they've been looking at what predicts well-being and longevity and health. And of all the things they measured, given what I just said about kind of our social kind of identity being absolutely integral to our well-being, the extent and the quality of people's relationships was the best predictor of health, longevity, and well-being in that study, and that's been replicated in a range of different areas. So mindfulness and kind of relationships, I think, is really an important area for inquiry. And there's a sort of ancient kind of Pali text, which is a story of these kind of two acrobats. What by acrobats I mean the sort of people who kind of in a tent on trapezes work together as a pair. And of course, when you watch that, you think, my goodness, they really need to understand each other and work well together, or one of them is going to fall. And the sort of older acrobat, the kind of more experienced acrobat, says to the younger novice and says, look, when we do this, you need to look out for me and I'll look out for you. And the novice says, no, that doesn't make any sense. What we really need to do is that I need to look out for me and take care of myself, and you need to take care of yourself. And if we do that, we'll be much better able to look out for each other. And one of the really key parts, I hope, that this sort of webinar series and your own exploration of mindfulness has kind of unveiled is this sort of idea of befriending ourselves, cultivating in our relationship to ourselves these qualities of interest and kindness and care, this ability to let go and move into courage, sense of patience, sense of balance and equanimity. And a bit like that kind of mixing board idea, that idea that I got from my colleague and friend Alison Yangu, is that we can switch and move these up and down depending on the circumstances. So with a particular relationship, there might need to be more of a sense of leaning in, and with another, more of a sense of letting go. Switching it up, changing it out. And that's what this story of the two acrobats is pointing to, is if I can really have a sense of befriending myself, I'm much more resourced to be able to befriend someone else. So the the inventory that we did just now of what nourishes me and what depletes me, and when are these things kind of mixed, that can be done also with our relationships. Maybe at some point in the next day or two, you can just think through the people in your family, the people in your friendship group, the people that you work with, the people that you kind of interact with through the course of a week and a month and a year. Which are nourishing, which are draining, why, how, And are there some shifts and changes that can kind of change that balance? So what Sophia was speaking to just now was she loves taking care of her grandson, Noah, but she also knows that with a chronic illness like Parkinson's, she has to really look out for herself so it doesn't become too much. So it's possible to be, with that sort of sense of awareness, really kind of recalibrate what's possible. I think I'd like to just, on this question of relationships, maybe just point to two more things. The first is the 50-50 practice. So just to remind you, this is, and maybe you can do this now as you listen to what I'm saying, is holding 50% of your awareness in your own body and mind. What's happening in your body and mind just now. And 50% of your awareness in the other person and what they're saying and where they're at. And people talk about this being an incredibly powerful practice. And it speaks to what the Blackfoot Native Americans, indigenous people were speaking to, is that sense of relationality, the self to others. Of course, they extend it beyond just other people, but to the natural world. And the other big theme that's been part of this webinar series is this sense of responding wisely. And this is speech and action. And one of the incredibly helpful kind of ideas that comes from sort of Buddhist psychology is this idea of wise speech. Is what I'm saying true? Is what I'm saying helpful? Is what I'm saying kind? And is what I'm saying timely? Now, this doesn't need to be a tortuous process, but it's pointing to this idea of between stimulus and response, there's a little bit of space. And in that space, can we just ask ourselves, is what I'm about to say true, helpful, kind, and timely? And speech, of course, is a form of action. Is what I'm about to do in a relationship true, helpful, kind, and timely? And that kind of exploration, I think, is part of the cultivation of relationships that feel healthy and contribute to our and other people's well-being. I want to just see if I can wrap up in the next few minutes with just broadening the circle of concern out beyond the self and relationships out to a wider world now. When I was writing this chapter 11 in my book, Mindfulness for Life, I was actually in Kyoto in Japan. And I was very lucky to spend some time in one of the sort of traditional Japanese houses. And they have these sort of rooms with large windows that look out onto the garden and onto the natural world beyond. And when you're in these rooms, you have this real sense of the natural world and the inner house being kind of related, and your eyes are drawn out into the garden. And your eyes are broadened out because the garden is landscaped so that actually you become interested in what's on the left and the right and the middle. And the particular house I'm thinking of was actually set in the sort of Kyoto mountains. So your gaze looks up and sees the mountains, and then it sees the range of mountains. And with this mindfulness practice, what we've been talking about is this sense of, through the appreciation practice, broadening and building. And these Kyoto houses, it's not an accident. They're designed that way. They're designed to have a sense of our connection to nature, our attention being drawn out, broadened, and uplifted. And it creates a sense of, I don't know, it creates a sense of ease, it creates a sense of connection, it creates a sense of, I'm part of something beautiful and larger. And those gardens are cultivated. and they are tended and they are designed. And I guess when we think about what is meaningful and important to us in our lives and in the wider world, it becomes a bit like a Kyoto garden. I mentioned I've just come back from India and I was traveling through the Himalayas. And it's just the scale and the magnitude and the depth of history and time of that mountain range. It's impossible not to have that experience of broadening and looking up and feeling, I don't know, something really larger and bigger. And that's what we're doing with this sense of intention and our values, appreciation and broadening and building. So because I want to make sure I keep within the sort of time window that we've got, I want to just sort of end on the sort of sense of mindfulness of the self and of relationships and of the wider world with this idea that well-being is relational and systemic. It needs cultivation, like the Kyoto Gardens, and it moves through these circles. One of the kind of, I think, essential ideas in this idea of well-being as a skill is captured by some lines from the sort of German poet and philosopher Rilke. The first line is, I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. Widening circles of self, of relationship, and of the wider world. And then the next two sentences are really interesting. I may not complete the last one, but I give myself to it. So what Rilke is really pointing to here, which I think is really also fundamental to this idea of a life well lived, taking care of ourselves, taking care of others, taking care of the wider world, is that this is a work that is a work that will probably never be completed, and that's fine, but we give our energy to it nonetheless. Part of the sort of humbling part of being in India as well was this a realization that it's now, I think, the most populous country in the world. And I was just curious about the number of babies that are born there every day. So I looked it up. It's 6,500 new lives every day in India. Can't imagine the kind of world that they're going to experience. But what we're doing in our lives and in this sense of concentric circles is, as Rilke says, something that may not be completed, but we give ourselves to it. So just want to end with a sense of reconnecting, if we can, with this kind of sense of rootedness, uprightness, majesty of a tree, openness. I've used the word cultivation quite a lot in the last 40 minutes or so. May I take care of myself. May I take care of those who I love and in my life. May I live my life in a way that aligns with what's important and meaningful. May I take care of myself. May I take care of those around me who are part of my life. And may I live my life in a way that's aligned with what's important and meaningful. And of course, these are phrases you can adapt in whatever way you choose. Just inviting you to explore these practices and these ideas in the weeks ahead. And we'll return to them when we meet again for the final of these 12 webinars in a month's time. Thank you very much for your kind attention.